Welcome back to another edition of Caribbean Law TV. I'm your host, Jason Emmert. Here joining me again is Professor David Rowe, and alongside of me for the first time is Paige Reese, another student in our Caribbean Law class. Tonight, our topic is going to be on offshore banking. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emmert. Tonight, I'm defending offshore jurisdictions in the Caribbean. It is my thesis that offshore jurisdictions are very important in that they lubricate international commerce. Firstly, offshore jurisdictions permit individuals who are in countries where their human rights are being violated to send flight capital to places where they can keep their money safely and in a hard currency. This has preserved wealth for many individuals who would otherwise have been either punished or had their assets legally confiscated by dictatorial regimes. And that is a very important role of offshore jurisdictions. Also, offshore jurisdictions permits certain types of trust arrangements which are not currently being permitted in the metropolitan jurisdictions, but which also carry a value because they protect professional assets. Professionals who must be able to place their assets in a position where they cannot be easily reached by aggressive creditors, therefore value offshore jurisdictions. All of the major offshore jurisdictions of the world, particularly the offshore jurisdictions in the Caribbean, do not permit their jurisdictions to be used for illegal purposes. In the Caribbean now, all of the jurisdictions look very carefully to see if individuals are involved in either money laundering or narcotics or any other illegal type of activity which might influence or affect the method and security of their jurisdictions. It is very important that that is realized by the lawyers in the rest of the Western world, some of whom look at the Caribbean with a 30-year periscope rather than a modern appreciation of how the offshore jurisdictions actually work. Individuals who go into offshore jurisdictions nowadays must tell how they came by their assets, must say what the source of their income is, must give their nationality, their true nationality, and their true identity. This protects against money laundering and the misuse of the offshore jurisdictions by criminals or by individuals who have negative aspirations or evil intentions. Every single jurisdiction will have individuals try to either avoid or cheat taxes, and that is true whether the jurisdiction is an offshore jurisdiction or not. The United States should give more flexibility to its offshore partners in the Caribbean who are only trying to create a financial and legal atmosphere for flight capital and for investment capital to operate. Thank you very much for hearing me out. I hope that the United States will rethink some of its more aggressive attitude, towards the suppression of offshore jurisdictions, and realize that offshore jurisdictions are a part of the capitalist international world and the way funds operate internationally. Thank you very much. David Rowe, Adjunct Professor, University of Miami School of Law.
Thank you very much, Professor Rowe. It's certainly a hot topic right now in the United States, especially in this political climate. And now, presenting the opposing view to Professor Rowe is Paige Reese.
Hi, thank you for having me this evening, Professor Rowe and Mr. Emmert. I'm here to represent those who oppose Mr. Rowe's views. First of all, the United States is justified in having strict enforcement and being quote unquote skeptical of offshore jurisdiction and banking offshore. The IMF last year said that almost $600 billion of taxpayers' money had been laundered in offshore accounts, and most of this was drug money that was found in offshore accounts. One major problem that the United States and countries globally have seen is that it's near impossible to track records of money and banking accounts offshore. One problem is that transparency is currently needs to be increased. The IRS has qualifying intermediary requirements, which means that U.S. sources of investment and income are partly given to the IRS, but the majority of those are not, because records are not enforced and are not required to be maintained in these offshore jurisdictions. So why not shut down this process of having offshore banking accounts? First of all, 1/3 of the wealth of the world's highest net worth individuals, according to a Merrill Lynch wealth report, is actually found in offshore jurisdictions. So it makes perfectly sense that the money controlled by the wealthy in these offshore jurisdictions, the wealthy who have the power to control whether or not the United States politically continues to have people putting money into accounts offshore, they're not the ones who are going to man the fields to end this system. And second, after the 2008 banking crisis, people who deposited their money in these offshore accounts have not still received 100% compensation, which just goes to show that there's a certain level of instability in being involved in banking offshore. And therefore, I would say that the United States, in order to protect the tax-paying members who are investing their money domestically, should no longer support offshore jurisdiction and people who put their money in these offshore banking accounts.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. Professor Rowe, what do you say to people who share Ms. Reese's viewpoint? I mean, how do you combat her argument?
Well, Ms. Reese makes some valid points. However, I think that we must remember that the drug money generally comes either from the United States or from South America. It does not originate in the offshore jurisdictions, and when the offshore jurisdictions determine that there is drug money, they cooperate with the United States in making sure that money is frozen and returned to the law enforcement agencies which demand its return. Drugs are not consumed in the offshore jurisdictions, they're consumed in the United States. And certainly the United States should try to find domestic strategies of actually preventing the consumption of drugs, and so the need for drug money does not exist, so that they do not affect the offshore jurisdictions. The United States is influential in the Bahamas, in the Turks and Caicos, in Antigua, in Anguilla, in all of the Caribbean offshore jurisdictions. And the United States is able to obtain information about any offshore account that it presents evidence to the offshore regulators is in violation of United States law. Why isn't this sufficient? Why does the United States need to go the extra mile to create an atmosphere that will kill the offshore jurisdictions, lead to a great deal of dislocation in those jurisdictions, unemployment, and put people not only out of work, but put people in a situation where they cannot survive? And that is what we're dealing with in the Caribbean basin. A number of jurisdictions that will be placed in a very difficult condition or situation if the United States proceeds to continue its policy, its foreign policy, aimed at eradicating these offshore jurisdictions. So let us hope that cooler minds will prevail and that America's attitude to the offshore jurisdictions will become more rational, more reasonable, and more consistent with what international commerce demands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rowe. Paige, I'll give you the last word.
Though I completely respect Professor Rowe's opinions, I must combat his definition of where drug money is coming from. I think part of the problem is that it's near impossible for United States federal prosecutors to prosecute those who are involved in money laundering and fraud because there's no paper trail. There's no record of these transactions and these money wirings and these bank accounts that are created. It would be very easy to incorporate a company in, say, the Bahamas, and then to have a bank account in the Cayman Islands, and then from that account to transfer money anywhere across the globe and not have a paper record of this. So in terms of federal prosecutors trying to enforce the United States law, which is the supreme law of this country, it's near impossible with offshore bank accounts and what's happening right now in these offshore jurisdictions for us to uphold our own law. So I respectfully disagree with Professor Rowe, and I would argue once again that the United States should have stricter enforcement on offshore jurisdiction and should look carefully into how in the future we're going to move and to continue to combat what's happening right now with fraud and money laundering in these offshore jurisdictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. Again, thank you, Professor Rowe. And thank you for joining us. And tune in next week for another edition of Caribbean Law TV. Good night.
Good night.